Hello and welcome to the Module 2 lecture. This week we're going to be talking about the changes in American society, focusing on the 1950s to the present. Then we're going to switch gears a bit and we're going to talk about characteristic that abusive people generally have in common. So let's get started. So baby boomers, I hope you appreciate the humor here of the young man being lectured by the older gentleman from an earlier generation who he replies, okay, boomer, like whatever. So we know the US baby boomers refers to the explosion of economic growth and the explosion in the number of births that happened in this country after World War II. So anyone born in the United States between 1946 and 1964 is considered a baby boomer. This was really an unprecedented period of economic growth and wealth throughout this country. It was a period of record unemployment. Jobs were widely available and generally well paid. People who in earlier generations could not afford to buy a home could buy a home for the first time, sometimes even a second home. And children born during this period generally grew up with their married parents and usually several siblings. It wasn't uncommon during this time for families to have 4, 8 children, and even more. That was fairly common. And talking about the positive aspects of this period in American culture, it shouldn't be idealized too much. We note that racism was systemic throughout our culture. There was many other social issues that were going on, but we didn't talk about it openly in the 1950s. That didn't come until much later. So what did a typical family look like in the 1950s? Well, kind of like this photograph, a mom and a dad, 2 kids, here a son and a daughter. They're opening the piggy bank and mom looks like she's recording how much is in it. And the definition of a family back then was much different than it was today. Back then the term family meant a mother, a father, and children. And in some families and cultures it could also include maternal or fraternal grandparents. Divorce in the 1950s was very uncommon, and when it occurred, it carried a serious social stigma, especially for women. So a woman who was divorced in the 1950s might be completely cut off from her social circle. She wouldn't be invited to parties or gatherings. She may have a very difficult time getting a job. It really was a deficit to her reputation that she'd been divorced, regardless of the reason for that. Kids of divorced parents often carried a lot of shame when they'd go to school and see, the daddies dance or the mom and daughter dance. That sort of thing would be very difficult for these kids because they took an awful lot of flack in some instances for having divorced parents. Issues such as teenage pregnancy, drug abuse, and alcoholism, they certainly existed. They were not openly discussed, not often within families, certainly not in social situations, and definitely not in the media. Television was brand new in the 1950s, and all that economic growth allowed a lot of families to have a television in their home. Gone were the days where one family in a neighborhood would have a television and everyone would gather around it within their home to watch something. Everybody had a TV in their home. And TV programs at the time really focused on the perfect ideal of families, perfect moms and daughters, and the children were happy literally 100% of the time every day. There was no swearing depicted in television, especially in relation to families. There was no nudity. None of that existed in the early days of television. So here's a cutout of a magazine article from Housekeeping Monthly. It's very telling to just note that there was a magazine called Housekeeping Monthly. And I don't expect that you can read this version. So what I did was I printed an excerpt and you'll see it in the Module 2 article section. But I'll just give you a couple highlights from the Good Wife's Guide as it was published in 1955. For example, here's advice to wives of the time. Prepare yourself. Take 15 minutes to rest so you'll be refreshed when he arrives home. Touch up your makeup. Put a ribbon in your hair and be fresh looking. He's just been with a lot of work-weary people. Be a little gay and a little more interesting for him. His boring day may need a lift, and one of your duties is to provide it. Over the cooler months of the year, you should prepare and light a fire for him to unwind by. Your husband will feel he has reached a haven of rest and order, and it will give you a lift too. After all, catering for his comfort will provide you with immense personal satisfaction. Prepare the children. Take a few minutes to wash the children's faces and hands, comb their hair, and if necessary, change their clothes. They are his little treasures and he would like to see them playing the part. Minimize all noise. At the time of his arrival, eliminate the noise of the washer, dryer, and vacuum. Try to encourage the children to be quiet. Greet him with a warm smile and show sincerity in your desire to please him. Listen to him. You may have a dozen important things to tell him, but the moment of his arrival is not the time. Let him talk first. Remember, his topics of conversation are more important than yours. Make the evening his. Never complain if he comes home late for dinner or goes out to dinner or other places of entertainment without you. Instead, try to understand his world of strain and pressure and his very real need to be at home and relax. Do not greet him with complaints and problems. Don't complain if he's late home for dinner or even if he stays out all night. Count this as minor compared to what he might have gone through during the day. Arrange his pillow and offer to take off his shoes. Speak in a low, soothing, and pleasant voice. Don't ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. Remember, he is the master of the house and as such will always exercise his will with fairness and truthfulness. You have no right to question him. A good wife always knows her place. Now, it's really hard not to read that in a sarcastic tone of voice or even to laugh a couple times while reading that. And it is funny, and we can appreciate how funny it is today. But there are some points of it that are pretty serious. Basically, the point of this article is instructing wives to not be real, right? Don't complain. Don't tell them any issues that you face during the day. Put a face on, smile, use a pleasant tone of voice. Don't let the kids make noise. It's really asking the wife to create a really fake environment, to pretend that everything is perfect for the husband when he comes home. You'll see a whole printout of this in the Module 2 article section. But let's be honest, life for men wasn't really perfect in the 1950s either. Men were expected to be the sole financial provider for families, often large families. Imagine being the sole financial provider for 8 or 10 children and a wife with a mortgage payment. Men were not encouraged to view their wives as equal partners during this time. That's clear from the housekeeping article. And men were expected to be, not only in their homes, but in public, to be brave, to be stoic, to be unemotional. And asking for help was viewed as a weakness. And we know that the men in the 1950s who served in World War II came back home with serious problems. What they called battle fatigue back then, we now know to be post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And no one really knew how to identify it or how to treat it. So these men came back from serving their country with a variety of physical injuries and mental health issues that were poorly understood and really never talked about it. Here's a coffee ad from the 1950s. This is somewhat infamous now, and you can see it all over the internet. This is an advertisement in a magazine for Chase and Sanborn coffee. And what you see in this ad is a man has his wife over his lap. She's facing down, and he's striking her. He's about to hit her, and he looks like same way he would spank a child, right? The way he would put a child over his lap during this time and spank them. And the advertisement says that if he discovers you're still taking chances on getting flat, stale coffee, woe be unto you. So what this ad is doing is telling the housewives who do most of the shopping that if they buy the wrong coffee, it's totally acceptable for their husband to place them over their knee and strike them. That's what this ad said. It's pretty clear what it says. You don't really have to read into it. And in your extra credit this week, the question you're going to answer briefly on the discussion board for your extra credit points is, what do you think the response would be if an ad just like this appeared in social media today? What would the response be if this ad was on television or showed up on Instagram? How do you think people would react? Well, that's going to be your extra credit question for this week. And then we move on to the late 1950s into the early 1960s, and what happens is the civil rights movement. And I'm sure you know the civil rights movement was an organized effort led by Black men and women across the United States in the effort to end racial discrimination and prejudice, and many of them lost their lives doing so. But the bravery of the men and women and the changes that they were able to get enacted really encouraged other people and other groups to also get active and fight for their own rights. And those groups would include women and the disabled. So this is where a lot of women start protesting and demanding equal pay. And it's also when the American with Disabilities Act starts to get discussed in the public and throughout our government. So the brave men and women who fought for the civil rights for Black people really inspired an entire generation to demand that all Americans be treated with basic human dignity. So the women's rights movement, which really took off in the late 1960s and the early 70s, you can see the women photographed here are protesting the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a precedented event in our country for many reasons. And one of the reasons was because it really fractured families. It really pitted one family member against another. So the dads, the uncles of this time, had served in World War II, had lost their own family members, cousins, and brothers in the war, and came back, and their own sons are often refusing the draft and protesting against the Vietnam War. And it created this huge generational conflict. And while the 1960s in this country is often depicted as Woodstock and free love and the peace movement, it was actually an incredibly violent time. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 63. Martin Luther King Jr. in April of 68. Robert F. Kennedy was murdered the same year, later in 1968 in June. And for the first time in American history, these murders, these assassinations, were shown on television. This is the first time acts such as this are actually viewed by people, and sometimes they're viewing it live. That's a really shift change to have this kind of violence brought into your home. And we get to the 1970s. Aaron Pizzey is credited with creating the first domestic violence shelter in the world in 1971 in England. There had been other agencies and nonprofit type groups that had helped women who were in abusive relationships, but the shelter she created in 1971 was the first in the world that really focused on getting women out of abusive relationships. That's a real sea change. And just a couple years later, in 1974, she published a book called Scream Quietly or the Neighbors Will Hear. And what this book is about is how she started this shelter, why she started it. And then the book includes many case histories of some of the actual women that it served. And it's credited with being the first book published about battered wives. Now, that's a historical term we're going to talk about in just a few minutes, but we're going to use that term talking about the 1970s because that was the term used at the time. So she's credited with writing the first book ever published about battered wives. Now, if you think about it, the Gutenberg Bible was the first book ever published back in the mid-1400s, and it took 520 years of publishing for a book to be published about the violence women faced in their own homes. That says something. So after the first domestic violence shelter is opened in England, of course, Shelters started being opened in the United States, mostly in very large cities at the beginning. And you see the cover of this Ms. magazine. It's hard to think today how important magazines were 20 or 30 years ago. Used to have whole entire stores with nothing in it but magazines. They'd have 20 magazines just on home and gardening, or 20 magazines on men's health and weightlifting. And Ms. Magazine was the first magazine really dedicated toward progressive women's issues, talking about the women's rights um, organizations that were going on at the time about the work being done for equal pay and other issues. And this cover in 1976 very clearly depicts a woman who's been um, violently assaulted. She has a very large black and purple bruise under her eye. And of course, it's under the headline Battered Wives, Help for the Secret Victim Next Door. So this was considered very shocking in 1976 that you could be checking out of the grocery store and look over at the magazine rack and see an image like this. So let's talk about some of those terminology issues. So the first term used to describe this was battered wives. This is a historical term. The trouble with this term is the focus is only on wives, right? It only talks about violence that could happen to somebody who's a married woman. And it focuses a bit too much on physical violence. Physical violence is important in our study, but we know that there's a lot of types of violence perpetrated against loved ones that's not necessarily a physical battery. And of course, it leaves out men entirely. It would lead you to believe that men can't be victims of family violence, and of course, we know that's not to be true. Battered women is a little better of a term. Again, it's a historical term. The focus shifted to the term covering all women, not just wives, but could include women who are unmarried. But of course, it omits men as being victims of violence. And again, it's still focusing on that battery. It's focusing on physical assault only. Domestic violence is a modern term. Of course, that's much better, includes both women and men. Some people have trouble with this word because the focus is on domestic, meaning who a person lives with. So that would exclude violence that occurs between people who are just dating each other. It also excludes violence that would happen with a former partner. And we're going to talk a lot about this semester that some of the most severe forms of domestic violence, especially murder, occurs after a relationship is ended. So domestic violence, without stating so, sort of implies violence between people who are living together. And we know it needs to be broader than that. Intimate partner violence is the newest term. Of course, we use the acronym DV for domestic violence and IPV for intimate partner violence. And our textbook uses both terms. It's a much better term. It includes both men and women as possible victims, and it's sort of an umbrella over a variety of relationships and conduct. Is any term perfect? No, probably not. We could probably find fault with any term that's applied to this, but the terms have gotten better over time and more inclusive over time. So we know that families have changed an awful lot since the 1950s, right? When we used to think of a stereotypical family in 1950 with a mother and a father and children and usually 4 or 6 or 8 children, that's not as common as it once was, right? Now we have families where we have 2 female parents with children. We have single dads raising children. Of course, we have single moms raising children. We have 2 dads raising children. We have an awful lot of families where grandparents are raising their grandchildren. So we have quite a generation gap within the same family. Families look a lot different than they did back then. So here's just a few statistics for you. Families are more diverse in 2020 ethnically, religiously, and stylistically than they ever have been in history. If you look at a family in the 1950s, even the 1970s and 80s, it was uncommon for people of different ethnic groups to marry and have children. And it was as equally uncommon to have people from different religions marry and have children. And we know there's the widest variety of different parenting styles, right? It seems almost a new style of parenting comes to light every week as different movements develop research and different ideas about the best way to parent. We know many women these days choose not to have children at all or choose to have children without a partner. People who are living together and not married increased 170% just in the period between 1996 and 2012. Women in 2020 have the higher income in 40% of all families. That's a huge change from 1970 when only 10% of women in families had the higher income. Today, 41% of all babies are born to unmarried parents. We know that families are much smaller than they used to be. Couples now intentionally have just one or two children, sometimes three. It's very unusual these days to see a family with 8, 10, or 12 children. People are also marrying when they're older. It was very common back 20, 30 years ago for people to marry at 18, 19, 20 years old. That certainly happens today, but is much less common than people getting married at age 25, 30, 35, or even older. And we know divorce is common today, right? There's really no widespread social stigma for being divorced. There certainly may be stigma within certain cultures and religions, but generally speaking, in American society, there's really no social stigma for being divorced. And there's been numerous other changes. We could probably spend an hour just talking about all the changes. This is just a few highlights. So, why is special terminology required at all? If a man assaults a woman, why don't we just call it assault? If a man batters a woman, why don't we just call it battery? Why do we need a special term for this type of conduct? And there's two really important reasons. One is that physical violence and the use of criminal terms only encompasses a very small proportion of the violence that can occur within a family and between intimate partners. And we also need a term that differentiates violence in relationships from violent acts that occur between strangers. So, for example, if a woman's walking down the street and a man runs up behind her, punches her repeatedly, grabs her purse, and runs away, that's a very traumatic event for that woman, no doubt about it, and it's a crime. But when that woman returns to the safety of her home, that man, her attacker, is not going to be there. He's not the father of her children. He has no financial relationship with her. And she can move on with the rest of her life without ever having contact with this person again. And we know that's a much different thing from being physically attacked by someone you live with, that you have a legal relationship with, a financial relationship with, and maybe who you also have children with. So we need to differentiate criminal acts between strangers and acts and violent acts that occur between members of the same family or between people who are in an intimate relationship. You're going to do a lot more theories in your textbook this week. You're going to read about social stress, power, dependency, alcohol, pregnancy, and marriage. You're going to read about how these factors are relevant to our study. So I'm not going to read that to you. I'll let you do that in the textbook. Let's switch to the characteristics of partner abuse. In the textbook, you're going to cover a few of these topics of your own. Some I'd really like you to focus on and really think about are traumatic bonding, psychological entrapment, social isolation, and economic stress. And there's also a good section on the dynamics of battering. I put battering in quotes because you know I don't like that word now, right? But that section of the textbook actually gives you an initial look at what we call the cycle of violence. And that's a really important topic. This is just going to be a brief introduction to that, and we're going to talk about that more later in the semester. So let's talk about common behaviors of abusive people. And here's the disclaimer. This doesn't mean if you have a bad day and you say something that hurts your partner's feelings that you're abusive. No one would say that, and I certainly wouldn't say that. Nor would I say if you've ever been jealous of your partner that you're abusive. So we're not saying that any one of these behaviors in and of themselves make someone abusive. What we're talking about here is common behaviors of prolonged conduct, patterns of conduct, the way someone acts most of the time. So let's look at a few of those. One common behavior of abusive people is that they have histories of family violence. They were exposed to family violence when they were growing up as a child, and oftentimes in their home, violence was accepted and sometimes even encouraged. So violence was commonplace in their family of origin. Does that mean that anyone who's exposed to violence as a child becomes an abuser? Of course not. We're just saying it's a common behavior of some abusive people. Jealous. Not jealous once or jealous for a moment, but constantly jealous. Jealousness that is irrational. Constantly accusing the partner of cheating, even though there's no reason to believe that there is. Not only being jealous of your partner being with another prospective mate, but being jealous of the time they spend with their own family members or with friends, or the time that they spend at work earning money. A constant pathological jealousy. Hypersensitivity, that's a term that applies to a couple different types of behavior. It applies to an overreaction to routine setbacks. So say if a family's having dinner and a child accidentally knocks a glass on the floor and the glass shatters, that the abusive partner would start screaming at the child and berating them for what was just a little minor accident that broke a glass. That would be an extreme overreaction to a routine problem. Hypersensitivity also indicates that kind of a worldview, their outlook is that everyone's against them. Everyone's out to screw them over. Everyone's out to scam them. Everyone's out to get one over on them. So it's a very defensive worldview is part of being hypersensitive. Controlling. This is obviously a big one. Controlling in a manner that their way is the only way. They don't want to hear anybody else's viewpoint or opinion. They're not going to ask their partner, would you rather do this or that? They're going to tell their partner what's going to happen. They often initiate very strict rules that must be followed. And it could be very minute matters such as where your car keys have to be placed when you enter the door. That is where your car keys go. And if you don't put them there, you're going to be in trouble. Like micromanaging to an extreme. The controlling partner has to make all of the decisions in the relationship, both minor decisions and major decisions. And the controlling abusive partner is always right. They're always right about everything. They're not going to ask for somebody else's feedback or an opinion. They're definitely not going to ask somebody how they feel about something because they're always right. Isolating. Abusive partners try to isolate their loved ones from other people and from sources of support. So an isolating abusive partner will insist that you spend time with them all the time. All the time. It's not that they enjoy your company and want to be with you. It's they want to manage you. They want you in their presence at all times so they can observe what you're doing, how you're doing, who you're talking to, what you're saying to them, and what they're saying to you. They'll insist to a partner that their family and their friends, they don't really love you. They don't respect you. They're just using you. They'll try to separate the partner from any source of support or encouragement that they have. They're trying to isolate them. And they always have it's an us against them mentality. It's me and you. It's me and you against the world. No one else cares about you. No one else understands you the way I do. If you didn't have me, you'd have nothing. If you didn't if you weren't with me, no one else would ever want you. Mood lability refers to severe swings in mood. Now, everybody can have a mood swing, right? You may wake up one morning, pretty good mood, a couple crappy things happen, now you're grouchy the rest of the day. We're allowed to have changes in our mood. But mood lability in abusive a partner is much more specific about that, and it's chronic, and it's severe swings in mood. So someone is quiet and calm and reasonable one moment, and within seconds can become enraged and be entirely unreasonable and out of control. And then just as quickly, they can be calm and serene again. Mood lability also talks about disproportionate reactions to events. That would also describe the father that freaks out on their kid because they accidentally dropped a dish during dinner. Or if there's a minor setback, maybe someone's supposed to be home at 5:30 and they arrive home 10 minutes late, and the partner is enraged and upset with them for being just 10 minutes late. That's an example of mood lability. Blaming is a very common characteristic in abusive partners. These are people who never take responsibility for their own behavior. They often say things like, well, you made me mad, or you made me hit you. They often phrase things in terms of, if you didn't do something, I wouldn't have something. For example, if you didn't come home late, I wouldn't have hit you. It's a very blatant way of blaming the other person for the abusive conduct. Blaming abusive partners also blame every problem on their life on some other circumstance that has nothing to do with them. Their boss is a jerk. Their coworkers are liars. They're just having financial problems. If they weren't having financial problems, they wouldn't act this way. Or they blame it on their own past. I was abused as a kid, so I can't help acting this way. All types of blaming that all allow the abuser to not take responsibility for what she or he has done. Rigid gender roles. So we spent some time talking about what it was like in the 1950s and the roles men and women were expected to play. And rigid gender roles in 2020 means someone who believes that men are only permitted to be strong, brave, and capable, and that women are weak, childlike, and need constant direction. And it's that, remember the medieval expression we talked about last week, a man's home is his castle? That's a rigid gender role. I make the decisions because I make the money. It's my house and you'll do what I say. Those are rigid gender roles. That's a common characteristic in abusive partners. The last one we'll talk about is verbal abuse. Like I said, anybody can say something hurtful, right? We've all said something hurtful to somebody we care about. And we feel that, right? And we apologize or we try to make it up to that person, or we at least recognize to them, look, I shouldn't have said that. That was mean. That wasn't very thoughtful. And I'm sorry I hurt your feelings. We can all say something that's mean to someone. That's not what verbal abuse is. Verbal abuse is, again, that pattern of behavior. It's the way a person acts almost all of the time. So verbal abusers are hypercritical. They will nitpick even the smallest thing. Your hair doesn't look right. Your shirt is a stupid color. Why are you carrying that bag? Your laugh sounds stupid. You sneeze too loud. It's just this constant hypercritical nitpicking. It can also be very insulting. It can include degrading name calling. And people who verbally abuse other people in relationships often try to brush it off. So if someone called their partner a fucking bitch and that person said, wow, that really hurt my feelings. A verbal abuser is very likely to say, "Oh, come on, I was just kidding around. Lighten up. Why can't you take a joke?" Right? Also sounds kind of like blaming, right? Trying to not take responsibility for the conduct. So let's talk about a case study. So I'm not going to show you any more slides. I'm just simply going to talk to you about this couple. I'm going to tell you what happened in the beginning of their relationship. And while I'm talking, I want you to just sit back and relax. Don't fall asleep, but sit back and relax. You can close your eyes if you want. And while I'm telling you the story of this couple, I want you to be thinking about those characteristics. And I want you to see if any of them apply here. If while I'm describing this couple to you, you think, oh, that's an example of verbal abuse. I just want you to think about that while I'm talking. So Jess is a 25-year-old woman. She's a college graduate. She's bright. She's motivated. She's got a great job. She has a nice family that she spends a lot of time with. She has a lot of friends. She has a lot of coworkers who enjoy her company. And she's got a pretty good life. She's pretty happy with her life. But she'd really like to have a boyfriend. She really misses having someone to date and spend time with in her life. So she's on a dating app and she meets Rick. Rick is also 25. And first they talk by text message, and then they have a few phone calls, and they're hitting it off and seem to have a lot in common, so they agree to meet in person. And they have their first date in May, and they have dinner together. And Jess is kind of knocked off her feet. Rick is charming, he's good looking, he's funny, and most important to her, he really seems to take an interest in her life. A lot of the date isn't him talking about him, but he's trying to learn more about her. He asks her about her job, where she went to school, why she studied her particular major, asked her about what she does every day for work, what she likes and doesn't like about her job, asked her about her friends and her hobbies, her dreams for the future. And Jess is kind of knocked out. She's never had a date like this where just upon meeting somebody's showing so much interest in her and really seems to care about getting to know her and wanting to get to know her better. And after their date ends and Jess goes home, Rick calls her right up that very first night and he says, I'm sure this breaks all the rules about dating, but I could not wait to tell you what an awesome time I had. And I really enjoyed meeting you. And I really hope we can go out again. Do you want to do something tomorrow night? And Jess is like, heck yeah, I had a great time. Let's go out to dinner tomorrow night. And they start seeing each other almost every night. And during the conversations they have, Rick discloses a bit about his family to her. And while Jess had a really fun and loving family, her parents have been married over 30 years. She has a brother she's close to and really loves a lot. And they still spend every holiday together, even though her brother's married. He still comes home and brings his wife to spend holidays with his folks. But Rick tells her a much different story about his background. He's not close with his family at all. He barely talks to them. He doesn't see them very often. He opens up to Jess and tells her that his father actually physically abused him repeatedly while he was growing up. And he describes his families as users. He's like, they just use everybody. They're no good. They'll never help me with anything. I'm not helping them with anything. I really don't want anything to do with them. And at the time through those first couple dates, Rick is living with a roommate, just a friend in an apartment. And Jess is sharing her apartment with Charisse. And Charisse is her best friend. They've been friends since childhood. They've been through thick and thin together. They're really close. So as Rick and Jess start spending more time together, Rick never wants to go to his place, so they always go to Jess's apartment. And Rick acts a little different around Jess's roommate, Charisse. When Charisse is around, Rick is really quiet. He doesn't say much. He's not rude, but he's not really friendly either. And Charisse kind of is confused by this because every time Jess talks about him, she talks about he's so funny and he's so friendly and he's so warm and he's so personable. And Charisse just really isn't seeing it. And when she talks to Jess about that and is like, it's weird you talk about how funny and friendly he is, but when he's here, he doesn't even say two words. And Jess explains like you don't really know him. You really need to get to know him. You don't know him like I know him. And he's had it really tough. He had a really tough upbringing, and I won't tell everything he's told me, but let's just say it wasn't good. And he gets shy, and I think if you get to know him better, you'll see him the way I do. And Teresa's like, okay, whatever you say. And about 3 weeks into their relationship, Rick calls Jess one day, really upset, and he says that he's lost his job, and because he's not going to be able to pay his rent, his roommate's kicking him out of his apartment, and he is freaking out. He's at first yelling about the roommate, and then he's almost in tears, and then he's yelling about this jerk of a coworker he has who lied about him and got him in trouble at work, and that's why he lost his job, and he's just really, really upset. And Jess is, trying to calm him down. She says, look, I'm sure we can work this out. We can find you another apartment. I can help you find another place. And he starts telling her like that's not going to work. If I can't, find a place today, then I'm like I got to move. And I I really like you. I think I'm in love with you, and I'm really ready to take the next step with you, Jess. And I'd call me crazy. Like maybe I'm crazy. We've only known each other like a month, but I really think I'm ready to take the next step with you, and I think we should get a place together. And at first, Jess is kind of like, wow, I don't know how that's going to work. Like, Charisse is my best friend. What am I going to do? Kick her out of my apartment? But over the next couple days, every time Rick calls her, he's so upset and so worried that he's going to end up homeless. He's going to end up out on the streets. That Jess finally talks to Charisse. And Charisse is like, you want me to move out for somebody you've known like a month? And Jess explains to her, look, he's really special to me. I've never felt this way about anybody. And he really wants to take our relationship to the next step. And I've been waiting for somebody who's really ready for a commitment. And Charisse she realizes she's defeated, and she says, whatever, I'm going to move out, move him in, whatever you're going to do. And their friendship really takes a hit with that. And Rick moves in, and he tells her, look, Charisse, she's just jealous of you. She's just jealous. She wishes she had a boyfriend. She wishes that she had what we have. And one time she even hit on me, Jess. Do you know that? Your best friend even hit on me once. And Rick moves in, and it's great. They're getting to know each other more every day. Jess is working from home half time, and then she goes to the office half time. And Rick's looking for work. And since he has more time available, he takes over all the shopping, the cooking, the cleaning. Jess comes home, the house is immaculate, dinner's on the table. She's like, this guy is amazing. And they're doing really well. And Jess loves her coworkers. She doesn't get to see them much since she works half time at home, but she gets a lot of text messages inviting her out for drinks and dinner. And Rick lets her know that that's really not okay with him. Like she really shouldn't be going out with friends without him. They're a couple now. And if they're going to be friends with her, they really should be friends with him too. So Jess brings him along a couple times for cocktails with her coworkers, and Rick doesn't really talk much when he's there. Again, he's not rude. He just doesn't say much. He's not really sociable or friendly. And as soon as they've had one drink or maybe an appetizer, Rick's pushing Jess to leave. Like, can we just go home? I haven't seen you all day. I really just want to spend time with you. So Jess relents and she starts seeing her coworkers less and less. And they stop inviting her because every time they invite her, she either says no and declines and doesn't come, or she brings Rick with her and like they barely stay for 20 minutes. So they just stop inviting her. So Rick's been looking for work. Money's getting a little tighter because Jess is the only one working, but he's still doing so much around the house that she really appreciates. She's not even really upset that he's not contributing to the rent or any of the bills. And in some ways, she really thinks like she's never had it so good. She brings Rick to a few of her family events, a few social gatherings, and He's really uncomfortable with her parents. He says that tells her he's really embarrassed because he's not working and feels like her parents and her brother are really judgmental about that and don't think kindly of him. And Jess tries to reassure him and she's like, look, they're not judgy like that. They don't care as long as you're nice to me. That's all they care about. But he really feels uncomfortable there, and if he can get out of going to her parents' house, then he usually does. So she starts to offer to see her family alone and go to family events by herself. Rick's really not in favor of this. He really thinks that they're in a serious relationship now. They're living together. They sometimes even kind of jokingly talk about getting engaged and getting married someday. And he really thinks that they should be doing things together and that they should be spending time working on their relationship, not spending time with her family. And when she talks about the holidays and how they're so important to her to spend certain events with her family, he really persuades her that it's really time for them to grow up and start making traditions of their own. So Rick finds a job. He starts leaving the home at 8 a.m. every day and not returning until 6 o'clock or later. And during the day, whether Jess is working from home or she's at her office, Rick texts her through the day, really nice texts. What are you doing? What are you up to? Have you had lunch? I love you. I care about you. I'm thinking about her. All day long, he's sending these texts, like 30 or 40 texts a day. And she thinks it's really sweet. Like, really, no guy's ever paid that much attention to her. But as Rick's working and she's working, all the house stuff starts to slide a little bit. So suddenly the shopping's not getting done, the place isn't getting cleaned up every day, and Rick really starts getting annoyed about this. He really likes a spotless house. And he's annoyed with Jess because he did all the work when he wasn't working, and here Jess works from home half time, and yet none of this stuff is getting done. And when she does do the shopping, she never buys the right thing. He gives her a very specific list of exactly what to buy, the brand name and the amount. And she picks the wrong brand, she forgets items, and it makes him insane. So he starts talking to her about maybe not going to the office at all anymore, and that they could save money with transportation and car costs. They could give up one car, give up her car and just have his if she wasn't working at the office half time. And that would really give them more time to spend together, and she'd always be home when he got home. So Jess eventually agrees to work from home 100% of the time. So she's really understanding when Rick comes home and he's super bitchy. He's really grouchy, sometimes even angry because his job is really difficult and his coworkers are all a bunch of jerks and his boss doesn't treat him well. And Rick works really hard. He puts in long hours, but he feels like his boss and his coworkers are constantly undermining him. And he gets in trouble all the time at work for stuff that he doesn't do. And Jess is really sympathetic about that because she really feels for him. He worked hard finding this job, and once he found the job, he puts in a lot of hours, and she really feels badly for him. So when he comes home grouchy or bitchy or complaining, sometimes he might even call her a bitch for the way she's acting. She just figures, look, it's just this job, and either things at the job will improve or he'll get another job, but it's not that big of a deal. And then Thanksgiving comes up. And Jess is really excited to bring Rick home to her parents for Thanksgiving, like she goes home to her parents every year. And she's excited because her brother, who lives out of town, is going to be there with his wife. And Rick's reluctant to go to Thanksgiving at her parents', but he ultimately agrees and says, okay, one last Thanksgiving, we can go to your folks. So the day before Thanksgiving, Jess is really surprised when Rick comes in the door and he's got about 16 bags of groceries with him. And he has a huge turkey and cranberry sauce and all the ingredients to make stuffing and squash and apple pie and pumpkin pie. No kidding, there's like 16 bags of groceries. And she's like, what is this all for? We're going to my parents' house tomorrow morning. And he says, well, I really think it's a better idea that you and I start our own traditions. And we're a couple, and it's time to grow up and stop running home to your parents all the time, and I'm going to make you the most beautiful Thanks dinner you ever had." And Jess is bummed. I mean, she's told her parents that they'd be there. It's late at night the night before Thanksgiving. But she also feels like maybe Rick's right. Maybe they really should be doing stuff on their own as a couple. So she calls her mom late that night and she cancels and says she won't be there. And her mother's kind of annoyed and she's also sad about that because it will be the first time ever that Jess wasn't home for Thanksgiving. And the next morning, Rick wakes up 6 o'clock in the morning and he starts cooking. He's making every dish that's ever been on a Thanksgiving table, and he cooks all day. And at 3 in the afternoon, he spreads all this out on a beautiful table with wine and candles. It's just gorgeous. And Jess sits down and they start to eat, and Rick's been drinking a bit. He was kind of sipping on the wine the whole day he was cooking, but whatever. He works hard, right? So as they're having dinner, Jess looks a little bummed out, and Rick says, "What's the matter? I made this beautiful dinner for you." And she says, "Well, I feel really bad that we didn't go to my folks' house. It's the first year that I haven't been there, and this is really beautiful, but I made my mom mad, and I feel really bad about that." And Rick flips out. He jumps up at the table. He gets right in her face and he starts screaming, "What the fuck is wrong with you? I worked all day for this meal. I spent so much money on groceries. I've been cooking since 6 o'clock this morning. You're such an ungrateful bitch. You don't appreciate anything I do. Why do you treat me like crap all the time?" And Jess goes up to toward him to like kind of comfort him and be like, "What is the matter? Why are you so mad?" And as soon as she gets close to him, he puts both of his hands on her shoulders and he shoves her really hard. And she doesn't fall, but she stumbles back into the dining room table. And she's shocked. He's never touched her in anger before. And she starts to say, like, what's the matter? What did I do? And he slaps her across the face hard. And she's stunned. And she's embarrassed. And she's confused. And she's hurt. And she sees her reflection in the mirror and she has a huge red, angry handprint on her face. And she looks at Rick and Rick instantly starts to cry. And he gets down on his knees in front of her and he says, "I am so sorry. I can't believe I did that. I don't know what just happened. I'm so sorry." And she says, "Why would you ever do that to me?" And he says, I don't know, but I told you my dad used to beat me all the time when I was young, and I was mad, and you came toward me and it just triggered me, and I'm so, why couldn't you just enjoy the meal I gave you, but I'm sorry." And she kind of gathers her wits about her a little bit and she says, "Look, I really need to take a walk. I'm just going to take a walk." And she grabs her cell phone. And it's like 4 in the afternoon. It's November, it's cold, and she's walking. And she's just having a flood of emotions rush through her. She's stunned. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Rick is the nicest guy she's ever dated. She feels bad for making her parents upset. She's thinking to herself, did that even really happen? Is that even possible that that just happened? And while she's walking, she thinks, who could I call? Who could I talk to? And she thinks about Charisse, her best friend. But then she thinks, how can I call her? I asked her to leave our apartment for this guy. This is a guy she said that she didn't really like. She's never gonna, what is she gonna say? "I told you so"? I don't need to hear that right now. And she never even got to know him, so all she's gonna think about is this. She'll never even give him a chance. And she can't really call a coworker, she thinks, because she's barely even seen her coworkers. And if she doesn't really want anyone to know about this, she definitely doesn't want people she works with to know about this. And they never really liked him or gave him a chance either. And she thinks about calling her mom, who she's really close to. But the last time she talked to her mom was kind of mad at her for canceling. And Rick's always so afraid they're judging him already. If she tells her parents about this, he'll never go to her parents' house again, and her parents probably won't let him come to their house again. So now what is she going to do for Christmas? What is she going to do on every holiday? And she thinks to herself, he's been so open and honest with me about being abused as a child, and what I did probably did trigger him. And maybe if I hadn't gotten close to him when he was so upset, maybe he wouldn't have slapped. He wouldn't have reacted like that. And while all these thoughts are swirling through her mind, she thinks, I don't even know what to think. And then she gets a phone call and she sees it's from her mom. And she picks up the phone, and before her mother can even speak, she starts to apologizing for canceling. And her mother interrupts and says, "Oh my God, Jess, you're not going to believe it. You missed the best news tonight. Your brother's having a baby. They announced it tonight. I can't believe it. I'm going to be a grandmother. I'm so excited. I don't know whether I want a boy or a girl. I think either would be great. And we were talking about names, and it was so much fun, and I wish you'd been there." And her mother's so excited she can barely contain herself. And after a while, her mom kind of winds down. She says, "Oh, geez, okay, sorry, I'm so excited. How are you?" And Jess says, "I'm fine." And that's all she says. "I'm fine." And she hangs up with her mom and she's walking back to their house. And Rick is texting her over and over again, "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. I'll go get help. I'll do anything you want." And Jess goes home. So having heard this story about this couple, I hope you were able to spot some of those characteristics we talked about in Rick's behavior. We're going to talk a lot more later on in the semester about Jess's response to Rick's behavior and how other victims of family violence respond to that first initial act of violence. And in this week's video, you're going to hear a really good speaker. Her TED Talk's been viewed, I think, something like 2 million times, about her own experience as a victim of domestic violence. And she talks about how her relationship with this man changed over time. And when she's talking, I'd like you to also think about the characteristics we talked about and see if any of those apply to her story. I hope this lecture was helpful and informative. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.